The story of Kim Jong Il begins long before he drew his first breath, tangled within a web of myth, revolutionary struggle, and the brutal geopolitics of the 20th century. To understand the man who would later rule North Korea with an iron fist, one must first separate the elaborate fairy tales constructed by state propagandists from the cold, documented realities of history. In the official version of North Korean history, the birth of Kim Jong Il was a cosmic event foretold by nature itself. According to state lore, he was born on the sacred slopes of Mount Pektu, the mythical birthplace of the Korean people, on February 16, 1942. Pyongyang's propaganda machine claimed that his birth was heralded by a bright star shining in the winter sky, the sudden appearance of a double rainbow, and the spontaneous blooming of flowers across the frozen landscape. To the citizens of North Korea, this narrative framed him not merely as a political leader, but as a demigod destined from the heavens to guide the nation. Historical records, however, tell a vastly different, more grounded story. Soviet military archives and reliable biographical research indicate that Kim Jong Il was actually born in February 1941 in a modest village near Khabarovsk in the Soviet Far East, where his father, Kim Il-sung, was stationed as a captain in the Soviet Red Army. During the Japanese occupation of Korea, which began in 1910 and subjected the Korean peninsula to harsh colonial rule, cultural assimilation, and brutal economic exploitation, Korean resistance fighters had fled across the border into Manchuria and the Soviet Union. Kim Il-sung had joined anti-Japanese guerrilla units before eventually seeking refuge in Soviet territory as Japanese forces pressed their campaign across Manchuria. It was within this military encampment, far from the sacred peaks of Mount Pektu, that the future ruler of North Korea spent his earliest months. In his family circle, he was given a Russian birth name, Yuri Ursanovich Kim, reflecting the deep ties his father maintained with Soviet authorities during World War II. The geopolitical landscape of East Asia shifted dramatically with the defeat of Imperial Japan in August 1945. As Soviet forces swept down through the Korean peninsula from the north, and American troops landed in the south, the Allied powers divided Korea along the 38th parallel as a temporary measure to facilitate the surrender of Japanese forces. What was intended as a provisional administrative border quickly hardened into a permanent ideological divide amid the escalating Cold War. In the northern half of the peninsula, the Soviet Union sought a reliable, loyal figure to establish a communist buffer state. Joseph Stalin and the Soviet leadership selected Kim Il-sung, viewing him as a battle-tested guerrilla leader who could effectively manage Soviet interests in the region. Backed by Soviet tanks, political advisors, and economic aid, Kim Il-sung returned to Pyongyang in September 1945 as a youthful hero of the anti-Japanese struggle, though his actual combat record had been heavily embellished by Soviet and later North Korean propaganda. Returning to a war-torn and impoverished country, young Kim Jong Il, then just a small boy, arrived back in Pyongyang alongside his mother, Kim Jong-suk, a fellow guerrilla fighter who had endured the bitter cold and relentless skirmishes of the Manchurian forests. The domestic environment into which Kim Jong-il stepped was charged with revolutionary fervor, suspicion, and ruthless political consolidation. Kim Il-sung immediately set about neutralizing his political opponents, purging rival communist factions, nationalists, and religious leaders who threatened his absolute authority. By 1948, the formal establishment of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, was proclaimed, directly mirroring the creation of the Republic of Korea, South Korea, months prior. The stage was set for a protracted, bitter struggle for supremacy over the entire peninsula, culminating in the devastating outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950. For the young Kim Jong Il, the Korean War was a formative, terrifying experience that deeply shaped his worldview. As United Nations forces, led by the United States, pushed North Korean troops back toward the Chinese border in the autumn of 1950, Pyongyang was briefly captured, and the Kim family was forced to flee north toward the safety of the Chinese border. Throughout the three-year conflict, which witnessed massive aerial bombardment by American forces that laid waste to nearly every major city and infrastructure project in North Korea, Kim Jong Il experienced firsthand the constant threat of annihilation. He spent time in safe houses and attended makeshift schools, often surrounded by military guards and party officials. This siege mentality, the belief that the nation was perpetually encircled by hostile imperialist powers bent on its destruction, became a foundational pillar of his psychological makeup. He learned early on that survival in the political arena required absolute ruthlessness, unyielding secrecy, and the total subordination of individual life to the preservation of the state. As the guns fell silent with the signing of the armistice in July 1953, leaving the peninsula divided along a heavily fortified demilitarized zone, North Korea faced the monumental task of post-war reconstruction. Kim Il-sung embarked on a radical program of socialist transformation, nationalizing industries, collectivizing agriculture, and eradicating private property. Inspired by the devastation of the war, Kim Il-sung also developed the ideology of Juche, or self-reliance, which emphasized political independence, economic autarky, and military self-defense. While Juche was publicly presented as a brilliant indigenous philosophy, it was primarily utilized as a political tool to distance North Korea from both Soviet and Chinese influence, allowing the Kim family to consolidate absolute, unchallenged control over the party and the population. Growing up as the eldest son of the supreme leader, Kim Jong Il inhabited a gilded yet profoundly isolated world. While ordinary North Koreans struggled through the austere realities of post-war recovery, rationing, and intense ideological indoctrination, young Kim enjoyed access to foreign films, luxurious goods, and elite education. Yet, his childhood was far from ordinary. He was constantly watched over by bodyguards, party minders, and tutors who reinforced his elevated status. His mother, Kim Jong-suk, who had served as a protective and stabilizing figure in his early life, died tragically in 1949 during childbirth, leaving a deep emotional void in the young boy's life. Following her death, Kim Il-sung remarried, introducing stepmothers and half-siblings into the household dynamics, which fostered an atmosphere of subtle court intrigue, jockeying for favor, and complex family politics. During his school years in Pyongyang and later at Kim Il-sung University, Kim Jong-il demonstrated a keen interest in literature, cinema, and political organization. He was not a frontline military commander like his father. Instead, he gravitated toward the machinery of ideology, propaganda, and party administration. He observed closely how his father systematically dismantled potential rivals, absorbed competing political factions, and elevated loyalists into key positions within the Workers' Party of Korea. He watched as the portraits of Kim Il-sung began appearing in every home, public square, and factory, transforming a political leader into a quasi-religious deity. By the time he reached adulthood in the 1960s, the political system of North Korea had matured into a rigid, totalitarian dynastic state, one where loyalty to the supreme leader was the ultimate measure of human worth. The environment into which Kim Jong Il was born and raised thus laid the groundwork for his future tyranny. It was a world forged in the crucible of guerrilla warfare, shaped by the paranoia of the Cold War, and sustained by the systematic erasure of historical truth in favor of myth-making. As a child of the revolution, he inherited not just a country, but a political philosophy centered entirely on the cult of personality and the absolute preservation of family rule. The competing stories of his birth, the mythical star over Mount Pictou versus the mundane reality of a Soviet military camp, encapsulated the dual nature of his existence. A man protected by layers of manufactured fiction, yet operating within the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of real-world power politics. Armed with this upbringing, Kim Jong Il stood poised to step out of his father's formidable shadow, ready to weave his own dark chapter into the history of the Korean peninsula. The transition from a revolutionary guerrilla camp to the opulent inner circles of Pyongyang's ruling elite marked the beginning of a strange, privileged, and deeply isolated life for young Kim Jong Il. While the citizens of North Korea endured the grueling physical labor of post-war reconstruction, living on meager rations and participating in endless hours of ideological study sessions, the supreme leader's eldest son inhabited a world of absolute comfort, tailored education, and growing political exposure. Yet this life of privilege was far from normal. It was a gilded cage constructed by a father who viewed his family not merely as a domestic unit, but as the foundational cornerstone of an emerging political dynasty. In communist systems across the world, the concept of hereditary succession was anathema, a feudal relic that Marxist-Leninist ideology explicitly rejected. Yet, within the corridors of power in Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung was quietly laying the groundwork to ensure that his absolute authority would eventually pass to his bloodline. For Kim Jong Il, growing up meant learning how to navigate this unspoken ambition, gradually stepping out of the shadows of his privileged childhood and into the machinery of statecraft and party control. During his formative years in the late 1950s and 1960s, Kim Jong Il attended elite educational institutions in Pyongyang, most notably the prestigious Namsan High School, and later Kim Il-sung University, where he studied political economy. These institutions were not ordinary schools. They served as exclusive academies designed exclusively for the children of top party officials, military generals, and revolutionary heroes, surrounded by peers who would one day inherit the administrative and military apparatus of the state. Kim Jong Il occupied a unique and untouchable position. Teachers and fellow students treated him with extreme deference, knowing that his favor could make or break a career, while any sign of disrespect or academic failure on his part was carefully smoothed over by watchful party minders. Despite this pampered environment, accounts from contemporaries suggest that he was an ambitious, sharp, and increasingly demanding student who took a deep, obsessive interest in how power was organized, maintained, and projected across society. It was during his university years that Kim Jong Il's lifelong fascination with cinema, media, and psychological manipulation began to take root. While other communist youth leaders focused strictly on Marxist texts, agricultural quotas, or heavy industrial output, Kim Jong Il spent countless hours in private screening rooms devouring foreign films. North Korea's film archives, strictly sealed off from the general public, held a massive collection of international cinema, ranging from Hollywood classics and Soviet war epics to European art house films and Japanese samurai movies. Kim Jong Il studied these cinematic works not merely for entertainment, but as masterclasses in narrative construction, emotional resonance, and visual propaganda. He recognized early on that film possessed a unique, hypnotic power capable of swaying human emotions far more effectively than dry political speeches or heavy ideological pamphlets. This early obsession would later transform him into the chief architect of North Korea's cultural apparatus, where he personally oversaw the production of revolutionary operas, feature films, and mass games designed to shape the psychological landscape of the entire population. As Kim Jong Il moved through his university education and into his early 20s, his father began integrating him into the inner sanctum of the Workers' Party of Korea. In communist states, true power did not reside merely in formal government titles, but within the secretive, hierarchical structures of the party apparatus. In September 1964, following his graduation from university, Kim Jong Il officially began working full-time within the Central Committee of the Workers' Party of Korea. This marked a crucial turning point in his life, transitioning him from a student of politics to an active participant in governance. Initially assigned to relatively low-level administrative roles within the organization and guidance department, the powerful organ responsible for monitoring, vetting, and controlling every party member and state official in the country, he was quietly positioned at the very heart of the regime's personnel and security machinery. Working within the organization and guidance department provided Kim Jong Il with an unmatched vantage point to understand the inner workings of North Korea's totalitarian state. He learned how dossiers were compiled, how loyalty was measured, and how potential threats to the regime were systematically identified and neutralized before they could materialize. He observed his father's trusted old guard, the veteran guerrilla fighters who had fought alongside Kim Il-sung in Manchuria, and began building his own network of loyal, ambitious young bureaucrats who viewed their allegiance to the Kim family as the ultimate path to career advancement. By embedding himself within the party's personnel bureaucracy, Kim Jong Il masterminded a quiet, methodical consolidation of influence, slowly replacing older officials with loyalists who owed their allegiance directly to him, rather than simply to his father. At the same time, Kim Jong Il began taking on a more direct role in shaping the ideological and propaganda direction of the country. In the late 1960s, North Korea experienced a period of intense ideological hardening, following internal factional challenges and growing friction with both the Soviet Union and China during the height of the Sino-Soviet split. Kim Il-sung demanded absolute ideological purity, driving the total adoption of Juche as the guiding principle of the state. Recognizing his son's acute organizational talents and his deep understanding of media, Kim Il-sung entrusted him with expanding and modernizing the state's propaganda apparatus. Kim Jong-il initiated sweeping campaigns to purge foreign cultural influences, tighten censorship, and elevate the personality cult of his father to unprecedented, almost divine heights. Under his guidance, giant bronze statues of Kim Il-sung began appearing across city squares. Red banners bearing revolutionary slogans flooded every factory and school, and the teachings of the supreme leader were integrated into every aspect of daily life, from nursery school rhymes to scientific research papers. This aggressive intensification of ideological control served a dual purpose. Externally, it projected an image of absolute national unity and unwavering strength to a hostile outside world. Internally, it created an inescapable psychological environment where dissent became virtually unthinkable, as every corner of public and private life was saturated with praise for the supreme leader. Kim Jong-il proved himself to be a brilliant, albeit ruthless, bureaucratic manager who understood that maintaining a totalitarian state required more than just physical coercion. It required the systematic colonization of the human mind. He orchestrated massive mass propaganda spectacles, such as the massive Arirang mass games, and carefully choreographed state anniversaries, transforming collective human movement into a mesmerizing display of absolute obedience and state power. As Kim Jong Il grew more confident in his administrative abilities, the question of succession began to transition from a quiet family discussion into a calculated political strategy. Within communist leadership circles, the idea of a father passing supreme power to his son ran counter to every tenet of socialist egalitarianism, drawing quiet skepticism and potential opposition from veteran revolutionaries, who envisioned a collective leadership model after Kim Il-sung's eventual passing. To overcome this resistance, Kim Jong Il and his supporters initiated a multi-layered strategy that combined ideological re-education with the systematic elimination of political rivals. They framed the concept of hereditary succession not as a feudal monarchy, but as the unique historical necessity of ensuring the continuous, unbroken lineage of the revolutionary spirit. According to this carefully manufactured narrative, only a direct descendant possessing the pure bloodline of Mount Pictou could faithfully carry forward Kim Il-sung's revolutionary cause. Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, Kim Jong Il worked tirelessly behind the scenes to marginalize any party officials, military commanders, or family members who posed a threat to his eventual ascent. One notable figure who fell victim to this quiet political maneuvering was Kim Jong-il, his younger half-brother, as well as various uncles and veteran party cadres who dared to question the wisdom of dynastic succession. By controlling access to Kim Il-sung, filtering the flow of reports and intelligence reaching the supreme leader, and carefully managing the appointments within the party secretariat, Kim Jong-il effectively became the gatekeeper to absolute power. He ensured that anyone seeking an audience with the supreme leader had to first pass through his approval, thereby making himself an indispensable pillar of the regime. This careful, deliberate rise from a privileged, cinema-obsessed university student into the undisputed heir apparent did not happen overnight. It was the result of meticulous planning, ruthless administrative maneuvering, and an unyielding commitment to his father's vision of absolute control. By the time the 1970s dawned, the shy, bookish boy who had fled the flames of the Korean War in a Soviet transport truck had matured into a hardened political operator. He had mastered the dark arts of party bureaucracy, censorship, and ideological indoctrination, positioning himself not merely as a dutiful son, but as the indispensable master builder of North Korea's totalitarian future. The stage was now set for him to step out from behind his father's formidable shadow, ready to claim the reins of absolute power, and plunge the nation into an era of unprecedented isolation, ideological rigidity, and eventual catastrophe. With his position inside the Workers' Party of Korea growing stronger, Kim Jong-il turned his sharp focus toward an arena that would define his entire career: the total control of human thought through media, art, and propaganda. He understood that tanks and police officers could force people to obey on the outside, but true totalitarian power required something much deeper. It required control over how people felt, what they laughed at, what they feared, and what they believed. While other communist nations relied heavily on dry Marxist-Leninist pamphlets and repetitive newspaper editorials, Kim Jong-il recognized that human beings are emotional creatures moved by stories, music, and visual spectacles. Drawing on his years spent devouring forbidden foreign films in private projection rooms, he set out to revolutionize North Korean culture, turning art into a weapon of mass persuasion and cementing the divine personality cult of his father, Kim Il-sung, while quietly building his own. His first major playground for this grand experiment was the realm of cinema. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, North Korean films were stiff, predictable, and heavily ideological, struggling to hold the attention of ordinary citizens who found them boring compared to the dramatic flair of foreign movies. Kim Jong Il decided that this had to change completely. He stepped in as the direct overseer of the state's film industry, issuing detailed guidelines, writing screenplays, and personally critiquing completed movies down to the single frame. He famously declared that cinema was the most important of all arts, and that a good revolutionary film could inspire the masses more effectively than 100 political speeches. He poured immense state resources into the Pyongyang Cinematic and Dramatic Arts University and the Korean Film Studio, demanding that directors adopt fast-paced plots, emotionally stirring musical scores, and high production values while maintaining strict ideological orthodoxy. Under his meticulous direction, North Korean cinema shifted from dry political lectures into sweeping melodramas and historical epics. The plots were always formulaic: brave, selfless workers, heroic soldiers, and wise revolutionary martyrs facing terrible trials, usually orchestrated by wicked American imperialists or Japanese colonialists, and ultimately triumphing through absolute loyalty to the Suryong, the supreme leader. Kim Jong Il personally supervised the production of massive cinematic masterpieces, such as the multi-part historical epic Sea of Blood and the revolutionary opera The Flower Girl, which became massive cultural sensations across the country. Millions of North Koreans were herded into communal screening rooms and factories to watch these films repeatedly, weeping openly at the tragedies of the characters and learning to channel their deepest emotional attachments directly toward the ruling family. By blending emotional manipulation with political indoctrination, Kim Jong Il ensured that entertainment became indistinguishable from state worship. Beyond film, Kim Jong Il turned his attention to reshaping the entire sensory landscape of North Korea. He recognized that to make the leader seem godlike, the physical environment of the country had to reflect his supreme status. Working closely with urban planners, artists, and architects, he orchestrated the transformation of Pyongyang and provincial cities into massive open-air museums of the Kim family cult. Massive bronze statues of Kim Il-sung, towering tens of feet into the air, began rising across the nation, engineered so that citizens passing by were required to bow in unison, regardless of the weather. Every factory floor, school classroom, hospital waiting room, and living room wall was mandated to display identical portraits of Kim Il-sung, which were inspected regularly by party officials to ensure they were clean, polished, and treated with absolute reverence. Citizens were issued red badges bearing the face of the supreme leader, which had to be worn constantly over their hearts as a visible sign of loyalty. Print media, radio, and television were locked down with an iron fist. North Korea became one of the most closed information networks on Earth. Radios and televisions sold in the country were permanently fixed to state frequencies, completely incapable of receiving foreign broadcasts, and possessing a dial that could be altered by citizens was treated as a severe political crime akin to treason. Newspapers published only glowing accounts of Kim Il-sung's daily activities, framing him as a benevolent, all-knowing father figure who personally guided everything from agricultural harvests to industrial factory outputs. Every successful invention, scientific breakthrough, or athletic victory was attributed entirely to the direct guidance and personal wisdom of the leader. Through relentless repetition across every conceivable medium, the state successfully created an all-encompassing echo chamber where no alternative perspective, critical thought, or dissenting voice could possibly survive. As Kim Jong Il expanded his control over the cultural and media apparatus, he also refined his methods of psychological surveillance and social categorization. He understood that propaganda alone was not enough. It had to be paired with an inescapable system of social classification known as the Songbun system. Instituted and perfected during these decades, Songbun classified every single family in North Korea into three main tiers: core, wavering, and hostile, based on their perceived political reliability and family background dating back to the Japanese colonial period and the Korean War. This invisible caste system dictated every aspect of a citizen's life, determining whether they could attend university, live in Pyongyang, work in a prestigious job, or even receive adequate food rations. By tying social survival directly to ideological purity, Kim Jong Il created a society where citizens constantly monitored not only their neighbors, but their own family members and innermost thoughts, fearing that the slightest slip of the tongue could destroy generations of their relatives. This masterful command over the instruments of mass persuasion also served a crucial domestic political function. By elevating Kim Il-sung to the status of an infallible deity, Kim Jong-il was subtly elevating himself as well. As the devoted eldest son and chief ideological lieutenant, he portrayed himself as the sole custodian of his father's revolutionary legacy, the only person capable of interpreting the complex tenets of Juche and translating them into practical reality. Whenever he visited a factory, cooperative farm, or military base, state media broadcasted his on-the-spot guidance with breathless reverence, showing workers weeping with joy as the young leader offered detailed instructions on how to improve production. These staged events were carefully captured on film and broadcast across the nation, slowly conditioning the public to view Kim Jong-il not merely as a privileged bureaucrat, but as an active, brilliant leader who shared his father's supernatural ability to manage the affairs of the state. Yet, behind the glittering facade of mass games, glowing bronze statues, and triumphant cinematic epics, the true nature of Kim Jong-il's cultural empire was one of profound artistic sterility and total intellectual starvation. By demanding that every piece of art, literature, and music serve strictly as a tool for political indoctrination, he strangled genuine creativity and reduced human expression to a narrow, repetitive set of formulas. Writers, artists, and musicians who dared to introduce nuance, ambiguity, or personal emotion into their work were quickly purged, sent to remote rural areas for ideological re-education, or vanished entirely into the growing network of political prison camps. The vibrant artistic traditions of Korea were completely flattened into a monochrome landscape of perpetual praise for the ruling house. By the end of the 1970s, Kim Jong-il had successfully constructed an airtight ideological fortress. He had mastered the dark arts of mass media manipulation, censorship, and psychological conditioning, turning the entire population of North Korea into a captive audience for his political ambitions. The cultural apparatus he built did not merely support the regime. It became the very air that North Koreans breathed, making it nearly impossible for ordinary citizens to imagine a reality outside the parameters defined by the state. With the populace thoroughly saturated in the mythology of the Kim family and the party completely subservient to his organizational grip, Kim Jong Il had laid the indispensable groundwork for his next great leap forward: the elimination of all remaining political rivals and the formal assumption of absolute power as the undisputed heir to the North Korean throne. With an airtight ideological fortress built around the minds of the North Korean people and the cultural apparatus completely under his thumb, Kim Jong Il turned his sharp, calculating focus toward the next critical phase of his grand ambition: the elimination of all internal political rivals and the formal consolidation of absolute power. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the young heir understood that controlling the media, film studios, and propaganda offices was a monumental achievement, but true, unshakable dominion required absolute mastery over the inner machinery of the Workers' Party of Korea and the formidable apparatus of the state. He could no longer remain merely the clever director behind the scenes or his father's trusted cultural advisor. To secure the throne beyond any shadow of a doubt, he needed to maneuver himself into a position where no rival faction, veteran revolutionary, or family member could ever challenge his right to rule. To understand the magnitude of the challenge Kim Jong Il faced, one must look closely at the political landscape of North Korea during that era. While Kim Il-sung was universally revered as the supreme leader, the party and the government were populated by seasoned guerrilla fighters, tough military generals, and veteran revolutionaries who had fought side by side with Kim Il-sung against the Japanese colonial forces in the mountains of Manchuria. These old guard veterans viewed themselves as the foundational pillars of the republic. Many of them looked upon the younger generation, and particularly upon Kim Jong Il, with skepticism. To these battle-hardened veterans, Kim Jong Il was a privileged prince who had never heard a bullet fly in anger, a bureaucrat who spent his days in luxurious private projection rooms watching foreign films rather than sweating in the trenches or organizing the peasantry. Recognizing this deep-seated resistance, Kim Jong Il adopted a strategy of patient, systematic, and ruthless political maneuvering. Instead of launching loud, overt purges that might alarm his father or spark a dangerous backlash among the military elite, he chose to work quietly through the bureaucratic channels of the party organization. Over the years, he had quietly embedded loyal followers, young technocrats, and ambitious sycophants into key departments of the party secretariat, the organization and guidance department, and the propaganda and agitation department. By controlling who received promotions, who was transferred to remote provinces, and whose career reports landed on his father's desk, Kim Jong Il gradually built a dense, impenetrable network of personal loyalty that rivaled, and eventually eclipsed, the traditional power bases of the old guard. The most dangerous internal obstacle to Kim Jong Il's succession came from within his own family. Following the death of his mother, Kim Jong-suk, in 1949, Kim Il-sung had eventually married Kim Sung-ae, who bore him additional children, including Kim Pyong-il and Kim Kyong-il. As the years passed, powerful factions within the Workers' Party and elements within the military began to rally around Kim Pyong-il, viewing him as a strong, athletic, and potentially more stable alternative to the increasingly reclusive and eccentric Kim Jong-il. For a time, a quiet, high-stakes bureaucratic shadow war played out within the halls of the Pyongyang leadership. The stepmother and her supporters sought to position Kim Pyong-il as the natural choice for leadership, whispering doubts about Kim Jong-il's health, temperament, and suitability to rule. Kim Jong-il responded to this family challenge with characteristic ruthlessness and tactical brilliance. Rather than confronting his stepmother and half-brother in direct public conflict, he systematically dismantled their support network piece by piece. Officials and military officers suspected of sympathizing with Kim Jong Il were quietly stripped of their posts, transferred to insignificant administrative positions in distant rural counties, or simply vanished into the growing network of internal security investigations. Supporters of the stepmother faction found themselves isolated. Their careers effectively ended overnight without a single public trial or noisy scandal. To ensure there would be no permanent rallying point for his rivals, Kim Jong Il orchestrated the gradual sidelining of his half-brother, eventually having him and his closest associates sent away from the capital on long-term diplomatic assignments abroad, effectively exiling them to foreign embassies in Eastern Europe and rendering them entirely powerless in domestic politics. With his family rivals neutralized and his network of loyalists firmly planted across every crucial lever of the party administration, Kim Jong Il began to systematically purge the old guard of veteran revolutionaries who refused to pledge absolute personal allegiance to him. He achieved this not by accusing them of treason against the state, but by weaponizing the very ideology his father had created. He introduced intense ideological re-education campaigns within the party, demanding absolute ideological purity and unquestioning loyalty to the party center, a carefully chosen political euphemism that referred directly to himself. Those veteran officials who questioned his policies, argued for economic pragmatism, or suggested that the party should return to collective leadership were labeled as factionalists, anti-party elements, or ideological slackers. They were quietly removed from their offices, their portraits taken down from party halls, and their names erased from official histories. As the 1980s progressed, Kim Jong Il's grip on the apparatus of the Workers' Party of Korea became absolute. He was no longer just the heir apparent in waiting. He was the de facto day-to-day manager of the entire North Korean state. Foreign diplomats, visiting dignitaries, and senior party officials quickly realized that gaining an audience with Kim Il-sung required passing through the rigorous, unyielding gatekeeping of Kim Jong Il's inner circle. Every major policy decision regarding industry, agriculture, foreign relations, and internal security now crossed Kim Jong Il's desk first. He used this immense administrative control to reshape the government in his own image, replacing revolutionary romanticism with rigid bureaucratic control and unyielding hierarchical discipline. This methodical rise to power was formally crowned during the 6th Congress of the Workers' Party of Korea, held in October 1980. For the outside world and the domestic population alike, this historic Congress marked the official unveiling of the hereditary succession plan. During the proceedings, Kim Jong Il was elevated to the highest organs of power, taking seats on the prestigious Presidium of the Politburo, the Secretariat of the Central Committee, and the crucial Military Commission. By securing these high-level positions, his status as the designated successor was cemented into the official legal and political structure of the regime. The announcement sent a clear, unmistakable message to both friends and foes within the country. The leadership of North Korea would pass from father to son, establishing the world's first communist dynasty. Following his formal coronation as the heir apparent at the 6th Congress, Kim Jong Il wasted no time in expanding his influence into the nation's armed forces, the Korean People's Army. He understood that in a heavily militarized state like North Korea, absolute power could never be sustained through party bureaucracy alone. It required the loyalty of the generals and soldiers who held the guns. Throughout the 1980s, he orchestrated numerous visits to military bases, frontline units, naval detachments, and airfields, presenting himself not just as a political leader, but as a military strategist. He showered the officer corps with luxury gifts, special privileges, and glowing commendations, carefully cultivating personal relationships with top commanders, while systematically weeding out any military figures who showed signs of independent thinking or reluctance to accept party supremacy over the gun. He also played a direct, aggressive role in shaping North Korea's aggressive foreign policy and clandestine operations during this turbulent decade, seeking to prove his toughness and uncompromising resolve to the military elite. Under his watchful eye, the regime engaged in high-profile acts of state-sponsored terrorism and military provocations, designed to demonstrate defiance against South Korea and its American allies. The most notorious of these incidents was the 1983 Rangoon bombing in Burma, an assassination attempt directed by North Korean intelligence agents targeting the visiting South Korean president, which resulted in the deaths of several South Korean cabinet ministers and officials. While the bombing failed to eliminate its primary target, it served a grim domestic purpose within the elite circles of Pyongyang, signaling to hardliners and military leaders that Kim Jong Il possessed the ruthless cold-bloodedness required to wage war against the regime's sworn enemies. Similarly, in 1987, North Korean agents acting under state directives planted a bomb aboard Korean Air Flight 858, blowing up the civilian airliner over the Andaman Sea and killing all 115 people on board. These violent operations, though universally condemned by the international community, and resulting in North Korea's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism, were carefully orchestrated to bolster Kim Jong Il's reputation among the military hardliners as a decisive leader who would never back down in the struggle against capitalism and imperialism. By aligning himself intimately with the military's aggressive posture, he successfully bound the armed forces' institutional pride to his own political survival. By the close of the 1980s, Kim Jong Il stood at the absolute pinnacle of North Korean society. Every potential rival had been discredited, exiled, or purged. Every major institution, the party, the media, the cultural apparatus, and the military command, was firmly anchored to his personal authority. He had transformed the communist republic founded by his father into a personalized fiefdom where his word was law, and his status as the future supreme leader was unquestioned. Yet, even as he celebrated the completion of his ascent to absolute power, dark storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. The global communist bloc that had sustained North Korea for decades was beginning to crumble. The Soviet Union was teetering on the brink of collapse, and the domestic economy was showing dangerous signs of stagnation. The kingdom he had fought so ruthlessly to inherit was about to enter the darkest, most catastrophic chapter of its entire history. The long-awaited moment of succession, prepared through decades of meticulous political maneuvering, arrived under a cloud of profound national grief and escalating crisis. On July 8, 1994, state media broadcast the shattering news that Kim Il-sung, the undisputed patriarch and founder of North Korea, had died of a sudden heart attack at the age of 82. For the millions of citizens who had been raised to view the great leader as an immortal father figure, the announcement felt like the end of the world. Across the country, people flooded public squares, weeping hysterically, tearing at their clothes, and collapsing in genuine despair before massive bronze statues. In the turbulent landscape of global politics, foreign governments and intelligence agencies watched with bated breath, uncertain of how the regime would react to the sudden loss of its unifying anchor and whether the untested hereditary succession would hold together or shatter under the pressure. At the center of this monumental storm stood Kim Jong Il. For over 20 years, he had operated as his father's chief deputy, pulling the levers of the Workers' Party and cementing his absolute control over the administrative machinery of the state. Yet, stepping into the physical shoes of the supreme leader presented an entirely unprecedented challenge. No communist nation in history had ever successfully transitioned supreme leadership from father to son. Furthermore, Kim Jong Il inherited a nation that was already beginning to groan under the heavy weight of structural decay, economic exhaustion, and international isolation. While the public mourning period was tightly orchestrated by the propaganda and agitation department to channel the nation's grief into absolute loyalty toward the new leader, the reality behind the closed doors of Pyongyang was one of extreme anxiety. To understand the immense gravity of the situation Kim Jong Il faced upon taking the reins, one must examine the severe structural weaknesses that had been accumulating for years beneath the surface of the North Korean economy. Since the nation's founding, its economic survival had been heavily subsidized by the Eastern Bloc. The Soviet Union and its communist allies in Eastern Europe had provided cheap oil, modern industrial machinery, chemical fertilizers, and guaranteed export markets for North Korean goods. This external lifeline had allowed the regime to maintain a semblance of a functioning command economy, masking the profound inefficiencies, rigid central planning, and immense military expenditures that drained resources away from civilian consumption. However, throughout the late 1980s, that vital lifeline began to fray rapidly as the Soviet economy stagnated, and Mikhail Gorbachev introduced policies of perestroika and glasnost, shifting toward pragmatic, market-based trade with Western nations. The final, catastrophic blow to North Korea's economic foundation came with the sudden collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Overnight, decades of preferential trading agreements vanished. Moscow demanded that North Korea pay for imports, particularly vital crude oil and coking coal, in hard international currency at world market prices, currency that Pyongyang severely lacked. Without cheap Soviet oil, North Korea's heavy industrial factories ground to a screeching halt. Power plants went dark due to a lack of fuel, public transportation systems stalled, and the chemical fertilizer plants that kept the nation's intensive agricultural sector functioning stopped producing. The socialist brotherhood that had sustained the Kim regime's economic model for over 40 years evaporated, leaving North Korea completely exposed and isolated on the world stage. Compounding these external shocks were the self-inflicted wounds of the regime's rigid adherence to Juche, or extreme self-reliance. Rather than pursuing economic reforms, decentralizing agricultural production, or opening up special economic zones like China, was beginning to do under Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s and 1990s. The leadership in Pyongyang doubled down on ideological purity and economic autarky. Resources that should have been redirected to feed the population or repair crumbling infrastructure were instead poured relentlessly into the military budget. Kim Jong Il remained utterly committed to maintaining the Korean People's Army as the premier priority of the state, adopting the guiding policy known as Songun, or military first, which elevated the armed forces above all other sectors of society, even as the civilian population began to slide toward disaster. In the immediate wake of his father's death, Kim Jong Il chose a deliberate and unusual path regarding his formal titles. Out of profound reverence and to anchor his own legitimacy in his father's eternal authority, Kim Jong Il deferred assuming the formal presidency of the republic. In a constitutional amendment passed in 1998, the Constitution was revised to designate Kim Il-sung as the eternal president of the Republic, ensuring that no living person would ever hold that exact title again. Instead, Kim Jong Il assumed leadership through his existing and newly consolidated positions as General Secretary of the Workers' Party of Korea and Chairman of the National Defense Commission. This strategic choice signaled to the political elite and the military command that while Kim Il-sung's physical presence was gone, his system, his ideology, and his family dynasty would continue unbroken under the direct command of his chosen son. Yet, consolidating power at the top did nothing to halt the gathering economic storm. As the mid-1990s unfolded, the combination of lost foreign trade, crippled industrial production, lack of fertilizer, and a series of devastating natural disasters pushed North Korea over the precipice. Torrential summer rains and massive floods in 1995 and 1996 submerged vast tracts of arable land, washing away topsoil, destroying grain storage facilities, and ruining the annual harvest. These environmental catastrophes acted as a lethal catalyst, instantly exposing the fragility of a food distribution system that relied entirely on state-allocated rations known as the public distribution system. For decades, ordinary citizens had depended on the government to provide their daily food supplies in exchange for labor and political compliance. When the state granaries emptied, that social contract shattered completely. Inside the halls of power, Kim Jong Il and his inner circle faced a horrific reality. The regime was trapped between its ideological refusal to admit systemic failure and the urgent, life-or-death necessity of international aid. For years, the government attempted to conceal the brewing catastrophe from both the outside world and its own citizens, using euphemisms and blaming temporary weather anomalies or the wicked machinations of American imperialists for the shortages. Citizens were told to tighten their belts, to endure temporary hardships with revolutionary spirit, and to remember that the party was working tirelessly to overcome the trials. But as daily rations dwindled from meager quantities to virtually nothing, the abstract rhetoric of revolution could no longer stave off the harsh physical reality of hunger. The international community slowly began to realize the scale of the humanitarian disaster unfolding behind the bamboo curtain. Reports from defectors, foreign diplomats, and humanitarian workers painted a grim picture of widespread hunger, failing health infrastructure, and societal breakdown. Yet, the North Korean regime proved remarkably reluctant to open its doors to foreign aid organizations, fearing that admitting vulnerability would undermine the absolute authority of the leadership and expose the population to outside ideological contamination. When international food assistance was finally permitted to trickle in through the United Nations and various non-governmental organizations, the distribution was tightly controlled by the state, ensuring that military units, party elites, and loyal security personnel received the lion's share of the relief, while ordinary citizens in the provinces were left to fend for themselves. This period of immense trial, which would later be officially termed the Arduous March by North Korean state propaganda, transformed the social and economic fabric of the nation forever. As the state-managed economy collapsed and the public distribution system ceased to function, ordinary citizens could no longer rely on the government for their basic survival. To stay alive, people were forced to adapt through informal, underground survival mechanisms. Black markets, known as jangmadang, began to sprout organically across towns and cities, where citizens traded household goods, smuggled foreign items from across the Chinese border, and bartered for scraps of food. This grassroots economic activity represented a quiet, profound shift away from total state dependence, laying the groundwork for a subtle cultural erosion of absolute government control from the bottom up. Despite the grassroots shift toward informal market survival, Kim Jong Il's political grip on the country did not loosen. Rather, it adapted to the crisis through the intensification of the military-first policy. By shifting the primary focus of state resources and loyalty directly to the armed forces, Kim Jong Il ensured that the generals, security chiefs, and military units remained deeply invested in the survival of the regime. He made frequent, highly publicized inspection tours to military bases, frontline posts, and naval units, projecting an image of an active, hands-on commander-in-chief who shared the hardships of the troops. These visits, captured endlessly by state television and print media, served to reinforce the cult of personality around Kim Jong Il, portraying him as a brilliant military strategist guiding the nation through a state of permanent siege. Externally, Kim Jong Il used the crisis and the looming threat of the regime's collapse as leverage in international diplomacy. Recognizing that North Korea's conventional military forces were aging and deteriorating due to a lack of fuel and spare parts, he doubled down on asymmetrical warfare capabilities, most notably the development of ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. By provoking international crises, threatening regional stability, and engaging in high-stakes brinkmanship with the United States, South Korea, and Japan, Kim Jong Il discovered that he could extract vital economic concessions, heavy fuel oil, and food aid from the international community. The nuclear and missile programs became not only a strategic deterrent against foreign invasion, but also a critical diplomatic bargaining chip to ensure the survival of his regime. Thus, the transition of leadership that began in the shadow of Kim Il-sung's death evolved into a grueling test of survival for both the North Korean nation and its new supreme leader. Kim Jong Il had successfully inherited the absolute monarchy his father built, but he inherited it at the exact moment its foundations began to crumble under the weight of historical exhaustion. By prioritizing military loyalty, weaponizing international diplomacy, and watching silently as millions of his subjects suffered through unprecedented catastrophe, Kim Jong Il proved himself to be a cold, calculating survivor. He navigated the most perilous decade in North Korea's modern history, not by reforming the broken system, but by tightening the screws of totalitarian control, leaving a scarred, starving, and deeply traumatized nation in the wake of his ascent. The transition from economic decay to absolute humanitarian catastrophe during the mid-1990s in North Korea is recorded by history as one of the darkest man-made tragedies of the 20th century. While the previous chapter examined the structural collapse of the state-run economy and the sudden loss of Soviet support, the human cost of those systemic failures manifested with full, devastating force in what the regime officially named the Arduous March. This euphemism, borrowed from revolutionary mythology describing Kim Il-sung's alleged anti-Japanese guerrilla struggles in freezing Manchurian winters, was repurposed by Kim Jong Il's propaganda machine to reframe a domestic famine as a heroic trial of revolutionary endurance. In reality, it was a period of catastrophic starvation, societal disintegration, and mass death that fundamentally altered the relationship between the North Korean populace and the ruling Kim dynasty. At the epicenter of this disaster was the total failure of the public distribution system, known locally as the PDS. For decades, the foundational social contract of North Korea's totalitarian state was deceptively simple: In exchange for absolute political loyalty, unyielding ideological conformity, and backbreaking labor, the government guaranteed every citizen a daily ration of grain, cooking oil, and basic household necessities. People did not need to buy food because the state provided it from the cradle to the grave. However, as the state granaries emptied in the wake of the 1991 Soviet collapse and the disastrous floods of 1995 and 1996, the PDS simply ceased to function. Families went weeks, then months, without receiving a single gram of state-allocated rice or corn. The government, trapped by its own ideological refusal to acknowledge systemic failure, offered no warning and no effective safety net, leaving millions of ordinary citizens stranded on the precipice of starvation. The environmental shocks of the mid-1990s acted as a lethal catalyst for a food crisis that was already waiting to happen. In the summer of 1995, torrential rains triggered massive, unprecedented floods across the Korean peninsula. Vast tracts of prime agricultural land were submerged under layers of mud and silt. Vital irrigation systems were smashed, and hundreds of thousands of tons of harvested grain stored in underground facilities were ruined or washed away. Just as the nation attempted to recover, another round of devastating floods struck in 1996, followed closely by severe droughts that withered the succeeding crops. The collective agricultural output of the country plummeted to historic lows. North Korea could no longer feed itself through domestic production, and because the regime lacked foreign currency to purchase grain on international markets, the food supply evaporated almost overnight. As the famine took hold, its impact swept mercilessly across the provinces, striking industrial workers, farmers, children, and the elderly with particular brutality. Pyongyang, as the capital and the political showcase of the regime, was largely shielded from the worst of the horrors through prioritized food allocations, though even urban elites began to notice shrinking rations and tightening belts. But outside the capital, in the agricultural breadbaskets of Hwanggi province and the industrial rust belts of the northeast, the situation descended into pure horror. Entire villages emptied as people took to the roads in desperate search of food. People began foraging for anything edible in the surrounding forests and mountains, boiling tree bark, eating grass, grinding corn cobs into powder, and digging up roots. Consumption of non-nutritive or toxic substitutes caused widespread disease, swelling bellies from malnutrition, and devastating internal organ failure. Public health infrastructure, already strained by decades of underinvestment and a severe lack of electricity and medical supplies, completely collapsed. Hospitals grew freezing cold due to a lack of heating coal, and doctors operated without basic anesthesia, antibiotics, or clean water. Diseases that had long been eradicated or controlled in the developed world, such as tuberculosis, typhoid, cholera, and measles, swept through a weakened population with lethal efficiency. Children suffered the most devastating consequences. Chronic malnutrition stunted a generation, leading to widespread physical and cognitive impairment. In many rural provinces, infant mortality rates spiked dramatically, and orphanages overflowed with children whose parents had either died of starvation or abandoned them in the hopeless search for food. The psychological trauma inflicted upon the population during the arduous march matched the physical devastation. The social fabric of traditional Korean family life, built on deep filial piety and mutual support, was torn apart by the relentless pressure of survival. Parents faced agonizing, unimaginable choices, sometimes abandoning weaker children to ensure that older siblings might live, or watching helplessly as elderly grandparents quietly starved themselves so the younger generation could consume their meager shares. Trust between neighbors fractured as theft of food became common. The once omnipresent ideological slogans painted on walls across the country, proclaiming we have nothing to envy in the world, became bitter, mocking ironies to citizens walking past emaciated corpses lying quietly on the streets of provincial towns. Despite the staggering scale of the human tragedy unfolding in the provinces, Kim Jong Il and his inner circle maintained a posture of rigid denial and ideological stubbornness. The regime's primary concern was not the salvation of its starving citizens, but the absolute preservation of the regime itself and the protection of the ruling elite's privileges. State media strictly prohibited any use of the word famine, labeling the crisis instead as a temporary food shortage caused entirely by natural disasters and wicked economic blockades imposed by the United States. Citizens were constantly exhorted to display greater revolutionary zeal, to work harder despite empty stomachs, and to place their absolute faith in the leadership of Kim Jong Il, who was portrayed in propaganda as bravely sharing the trials of the nation from the command posts of the military. Behind closed doors, however, the leadership recognized that total isolation could no longer be sustained if the state was to avoid a complete social implosion. Reluctantly, the North Korean government permitted international humanitarian organizations and the United Nations to send assessment teams and food aid into the country. For the first time since the Korean War, foreign aid workers were allowed to travel beyond the sterile confines of Pyongyang to witness the reality of the provinces. What they documented confirmed the worst fears of the international community: widespread, acute malnutrition, skeletal children in freezing orphanages, and a health care system entirely devoid of life-saving medicines. Yet, even as international food assistance began to flow into North ports, the Kim regime's deeply ingrained paranoia and corruption dictated its distribution. Fearing that foreign aid workers would witness the military's deep corruption, or that exposure to foreigners would contaminate the ideological purity of the population, the regime imposed severe restrictions on the movement and monitoring of relief supplies. International monitors were frequently denied access to distribution sites, and reliable evidence quickly emerged that the lion's share of incoming foreign food aid was systematically diverted away from starving civilians in the provinces. Instead, supplies were channeled directly to feed the million-member Korean People's Army, senior party officials, security forces, and the loyal residents of Pyongyang. The starving masses in the countryside received only a fraction of the international community's generosity, reinforcing the regime's core philosophy that military survival superseded civilian welfare. As the state distribution system permanently broke down, ordinary North Koreans were forced to pioneer an entirely new, illegal way of staying alive that would permanently transform the nation's economic landscape. Because waiting for state rations meant certain death, citizens began to engage in grassroots, underground commerce. Spontaneous black markets, known locally as jangmadang, began to proliferate on the edges of towns and along riverbanks. People traded whatever they could salvage: old clothes, copper wire stripped from factories, personal jewelry, and small quantities of smuggled food brought across the porous Chinese border. What began as desperate survival barter gradually evolved into a widespread, semi-capitalist informal economy operating entirely outside state control. Women played a disproportionate and heroic role in the rise of the jangmadang. Because men were often legally tied to state factories and collective farms, even though those workplaces no longer provided wages or food. Women had more freedom to move about the country, trade goods, and evade the watchful eyes of local security officials. They became the primary breadwinners for millions of North Korean households, a profound social shift in a traditionally patriarchal society. Through the Jangmadang, ordinary citizens learned to circumvent the state, realizing that survival depended not on the benevolence of the Workers' Party or the glorious promises of the Juche ideology, but on individual hustle, underground trade, and bribery of local corrupt officials. The rise of the black markets represented a quiet, irreversible erosion of the totalitarian social control that Kim Il-sung had spent decades constructing. While Kim Jong Il's political grip at the top remained absolute through military-first governance and terror, the psychological bond between the state and the citizen was broken forever during the arduous march. People no longer looked to the government as a provider. They looked to the market. They learned to distrust state news broadcasts, to view official ideology with cynical detachment, and to rely on smuggled foreign media, such as South Korean dramas and Chinese contraband, that began to flow across the northern border alongside food and consumer goods. Historians continue to debate the exact death toll of the arduous march, with estimates ranging widely from several 100,000 to over 2 million casualties, representing roughly 10% of North Korea's total population at the time. Entire communities were decimated, and the collective trauma left an indelible scar on the national psyche. Yet, through brutal coercion, strict rationing of information, and the ruthless purging of any internal dissent, Kim Jong Il weathered the storm. By transforming a natural and economic disaster into an instrument of political discipline, he demonstrated a chilling mastery of totalitarian survival. He preserved his dynasty and his absolute power, but he left behind a fundamentally altered nation, one no longer held together by revolutionary enthusiasm and shared socialist faith, but by a precarious web of market survival, fear, corruption, and silent disillusionment. The devastation of the arduous march left North Korea in a state of deep societal fracture, where the blind trust citizens once placed in the state had been shattered by mass starvation and the collapse of the public distribution system. For Kim Jong Il, the emergence of the underground Jangmadang markets, widespread domestic travel, and the influx of foreign contraband represented a profound and direct threat to his absolute power. While the previous chapter examined the economic survival strategies of ordinary citizens on the brink of death, this chapter explores how Kim Jong Il responded to these threats by reinforcing and expanding a regime built entirely on fear, absolute surveillance, and merciless internal terror. Rather than loosening controls to allow natural recovery, the supreme leader tightened the screws, ensuring that the state's security apparatus became an inescapable shadow over every facet of North Korean life. At the foundation of this totalitarian control was an expansive, multi-tiered security apparatus designed to monitor, evaluate, and discipline the population from birth. The Ministry of State Security, operating alongside the Ministry of Public Security and the military counterintelligence units, maintained a vast network of informants embedded in every neighborhood, workplace, school, and cooperative farm. Citizens were organized into mandatory people's units, known as inminben, where designated leaders held regular meetings to inspect homes, monitor visitors, and report any suspicious behavior, unauthorized economic activity, or unapproved political commentary. In this climate of pervasive suspicion, trust between neighbors, friends, and even family members eroded entirely. People learned quickly that a casual remark whispered in private about empty shelves, rising prices, or the supreme leadership could lead to sudden arrest, immediate disappearance, and collective punishment affecting 3 generations of their family. To manage dissent and eliminate real or imagined threats to his regime, Kim Jong Il relied heavily on North Korea's notorious system of political prison camps, known as Kwanlizo. Unlike ordinary correctional facilities for petty criminals, the Kwanlizo were vast, remote gulags hidden deep within rugged mountain valleys, completely sealed off from the outside world. Operating on the principle of guilt by association, these camps housed not only political dissidents, failed defectors, and accused spies, but also their entire families, including children and the elderly, who were guilty only of sharing blood with an accused individual. Inmates endured backbreaking, slave-like labor in coal mines, logging camps, and agricultural fields under brutal conditions, coupled with severe physical abuse, systematic torture, and starvation rations. The death toll within these camps was staggering, with thousands perishing annually from exhaustion, disease, and maltreatment. For ordinary North Koreans, the mere existence of the Kwanlizo served as a chilling, omnipresent deterrent against any thought of rebellion or public defiance. Beyond the remote prison camps, the regime utilized public executions and strict judicial terror to maintain absolute social discipline during and after the crisis of the 1990s. When desperation drove citizens to commit acts that threatened state property, such as stealing copper wire from factories, smuggling goods across the river into China, or attempting to flee the country, the authorities frequently staged public trials and executions. Held in open spaces like market squares, riverbanks, or sports stadiums, these terrifying spectacles were mandatory viewing for local residents, factory workers, and schoolchildren. The message delivered by the execution squads was unambiguous and brutal. Any deviation from state law, any attempt to bypass the crumbling socialist system, and any hint of treason would be met with swift and absolute destruction. Through these public displays of violence, Kim Jong Il sought to anchor his authority not in popular affection or economic prosperity, but in raw, unmitigated terror. Political purges were another vital instrument through which Kim Jong Il consolidated his control within the ruling elite and the Workers' Party of Korea. While ordinary citizens bore the brunt of physical starvation and public surveillance, high-ranking party officials, military commanders, and technocrats were subjected to intense ideological loyalty checks to ensure that no internal factions could challenge the supreme leadership. Whenever a policy failure threatened to destabilize the regime, or when regional officials showed signs of independent thinking or sympathy toward economic reforms, Kim Jong Il initiated sweeping investigations and purges. High-level bureaucrats were routinely demoted, exiled to remote provinces, or executed for alleged corruption, espionage, or ideological impurity. These calculated purges ensured that the ruling elite remained perpetually off balance, entirely dependent upon the supreme leader's favor, and fiercely competitive with one another for survival, thereby neutralizing any potential palace coup before it could take root. Complementing the apparatus of fear and surveillance was an unceasing, pervasive campaign of public loyalty and ideological indoctrination that penetrated every corner of daily life. Even as the country suffered through the worst of the famine, the propaganda machine continued to churn out towering portraits, heroic monuments, and endless musical tributes glorifying the Kim family. Citizens were required to wear mandatory badges bearing the likenesses of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong Il over their hearts, and every home and public building had to display portraits of the leaders, which were subject to regular inspection by party cadres to ensure they were kept spotless. Ideological education sessions were compulsory at schools and workplaces, where individuals were forced to engage in self-criticism and mutual critique sessions, confessing their ideological shortcomings and professing their eternal gratitude to the supreme leader. This relentless psychological conditioning aimed to fuse personal identity with state loyalty, framing all hardships not as failures of the regime, but as tests of revolutionary purity engineered by hostile foreign imperialists. The security apparatus also adapted to the rise of the informal market economy, transforming corruption itself into an effective tool of state control. As ordinary citizens turned to the Jiangmadang black markets to avoid starvation, local police officers, security agents, and party officials quickly realized that they could extract regular bribes in exchange for looking the other way. Rather than eradicating the informal markets entirely, which would have sparked widespread uprisings among starving citizens, the regime permitted a fragile, corrupt coexistence. Merchants paid regular protection money to local enforcers, creating a web of complicity where the very officials tasked with upholding ideological purity became financially dependent on the illegal capitalist activities they were supposed to suppress. This systemic corruption effectively bound the survival of the security bureaucracy to the survival of the underground economy, neutralizing bottom-up revolutionary pressure through decentralized payoffs and selective enforcement. In controlling the flow of external information, Kim Jong Il maintained a near-total blackout on foreign media, recognizing that outside knowledge was the ultimate poison to totalitarian rule. Radios and televisions were permanently locked to state frequencies, and possessing unauthorized foreign electronics, watching smuggled videotapes from South Korea, or listening to foreign broadcasts carried severe criminal penalties, often resulting in immediate assignment to forced labor camps. Border security along the Tumen and Yalu rivers was drastically reinforced with electrified fences, enhanced patrol units, and increased penalties for defection. Anyone caught attempting to cross into China was treated not merely as a criminal, but as a traitor to the state, facing harsh interrogation and imprisonment in brutal interrogation facilities designed to extract confessions and uncover potential underground networks. Through this multi-layered architecture of surveillance, informants, prison camps, public executions, purges, and relentless propaganda, Kim Jong Il successfully weathered the existential crisis of the 1990s. He demonstrated that a modern totalitarian state, backed by absolute ruthlessness and unyielding control over the instruments of violence, could survive the catastrophic death of a significant portion of its own population without yielding to internal collapse or democratic reform. The rule of fear was absolute, transforming North Korea into a garrison state where obedience was secured not through hope for a better future, but through the immediate terror of a violent and merciless state apparatus. As Kim Jong Il transitioned into the final decade of his reign, his grip on the nation appeared unassailable, resting upon a foundation of blood, ideological dogma, and perpetual surveillance that would outlast the famine and define the tragic destiny of generations of North Koreans. Building upon the regime of absolute fear and internal control established in the wake of the arduous march, Kim Jong Il shifted his strategic focus toward an ambitious and dangerous external objective: the pursuit and consolidation of nuclear weapons and advanced ballistic missile technology. While ordinary North Koreans struggled daily to secure basic sustenance from the informal black markets and lived under the constant shadow of the Ministry of State Security, the supreme leader diverted a staggering proportion of the nation's ruined economy toward the development of an atomic deterrent. In Kim Jong Il's calculation, conventional military parity with South Korea and the United States was permanently lost due to economic collapse, leaving a nuclear capability as the ultimate insurance policy for the survival of the Kim family dynasty. This high-stakes gamble transformed North Korea into a pariah state, sparking decades of international crises, diplomatic standoffs, economic sanctions, and tense geopolitical confrontations that permanently altered the security landscape of East Asia. The foundations of North Korea's nuclear ambitions stretched back decades before Kim Jong Il assumed formal supreme leadership, originating in the post-Korean War doctrines of his father, Kim Il-sung, who championed the ideology of Juche, self-reliance, and Songun, military-first politics. However, it was under Kim Jong Il's direct supervision that the clandestine nuclear program transitioned from early research reactors at Yongbyon into a weaponized, industrial-scale enterprise. During the 1980s, while serving as his father's designated successor and taking charge of party and state operations, Kim Jong Il closely monitored the construction of graphite-moderated reactors capable of producing weapons-grade plutonium. He understood that possessing an ultimate deterrent would neutralize the perceived threat of a U.S. preemptive strike, provide absolute leverage in regional diplomacy, and compel foreign adversaries to provide economic aid and diplomatic recognition on Pyongyang's terms. The first major international crisis surrounding this nuclear drive erupted in the early 1990s, just as Kim Jong Il was consolidating power following his father's death. When inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, uncovered discrepancies in North Korea's declared nuclear waste and demanded access to suspect waste sites, Pyongyang vehemently refused, denying international oversight and threatening to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This defiance plunged the Korean peninsula into a severe military standoff in 1994, with the administration of U.S. President Bill Clinton actively considering strikes against the Yongbyon nuclear facility. Disaster was narrowly averted through intense back-channel diplomacy and the negotiation of the agreed framework in Geneva. Under this landmark accord, North Korea agreed to freeze and eventually dismantle its graphite-moderated reactors in exchange for heavy fuel oil shipments and the construction of 2 proliferation-resistant light-water nuclear reactors, mediated by an international consortium known as KEDO. However, the agreed framework proved to be a fragile and deeply contested truce, burdened by mutual distrust and domestic political opposition in both Washington and Pyongyang. For Kim Jong Il, the agreement bought valuable time during the catastrophic famine of the mid-1990s, allowing the regime to focus inward on survival and internal repression, while keeping foreign military intervention at bay. Yet, underneath the diplomatic surface, the North Korean leadership harbored deep skepticism regarding American intentions, viewing the slow pace of light-water reactor construction and ongoing economic sanctions as proof of hostile intent. Sensing that diplomatic normalization would never fully protect his regime from external regime change pressures, Kim Jong Il covertly authorized a parallel path for nuclear enrichment using uranium, thereby hedging his bets and secretly violating the spirit of the accord. The fragile peace shattered completely in late 2002 when U.S. diplomats confronted North Korean officials with evidence of the clandestine uranium enrichment program. Rather than denying the allegations, Pyongyang's representatives openly acknowledged the program, leading the United States and its allies to halt the heavy fuel oil shipments mandated by the agreed framework. In response, Kim Jong Il cast aside all remaining diplomatic pretenses. North Korea officially withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in January 2003, expelled IAEA inspectors from the country, and reactivated the mothballed nuclear facilities at Yongbyon. The supreme leader had chosen open confrontation, signaling to the world that his regime would neither barter away its nuclear ambitions nor yield to foreign coercion, regardless of the economic cost to its starving population. To manage this escalating confrontation and break through international isolation, Kim Jong Il leveraged multilateral diplomacy as a tactical instrument, famously engaging in the six-party talks. Initiated in 2003 and involving North Korea, South Korea, the United States, China, Russia, and Japan, these complex negotiations were designed to find a peaceful, diplomatic resolution to the peninsula's nuclear crisis. Kim Jong Il proved to be a master of diplomatic brinkmanship, employing a cycle of escalation and negotiation, often referred to by analysts as the playbook of manufactured crisis. North Korea would provoke a crisis through missile tests or bellicose rhetoric, extract substantial humanitarian and economic concessions from anxious neighbors, sign disarmament agreements with vague wording, and subsequently find technical pretexts to violate those accords, restarting the cycle anew. Despite participating in endless rounds of talks, Kim Jong Il never had any intention of completely abandoning North Korea's nuclear arsenal. For him, the weapons were non-negotiable symbols of national sovereignty and regime survival, built at an astronomical cost, while millions of his countrymen suffered from malnutrition. The culmination of this decades-long strategy occurred on October 9, 2006, when North Korea conducted its first underground nuclear test. Though the initial yield was relatively small and partially fizzled, the seismic shockwave sent a definitive message across the globe. North Korea had crossed the nuclear threshold, becoming the world's newest de facto nuclear-armed state. The international community responded swiftly with severe United Nations Security Council resolutions and economic sanctions, but Kim Jong Il remained defiant, viewing the sanctions as mere background noise compared to the strategic security guaranteed by the bomb. Parallel to its nuclear program, the regime under Kim Jong Il heavily prioritized the advancement of ballistic missile technology, viewing missiles not only as strategic delivery systems for atomic warheads, but also as lucrative export commodities and potent propaganda tools. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, North Korean scientists and engineers worked tirelessly to develop medium and long-range ballistic missiles, such as the Nadong and Taepodong series, reverse-engineering Soviet-era Scud designs acquired via third-party nations. These programs relied on a clandestine procurement network that spanned the globe, smuggling dual-use machinery, specialized metals, and electronic components past international export controls. Test launches were carefully timed to coincide with major political anniversaries or moments of international friction, serving as dramatic demonstrations of military might that overshadowed diplomatic talks and demonstrated the regime's technological resilience. A particularly brazen display of this capability occurred in July 2006 and again in April 2009, when North Korea launched long-range rockets ostensibly intended to place scientific satellites into orbit, though international defense analysts recognized them as intercontinental ballistic missile tests. The 2009 launch, occurring shortly after the inauguration of U.S. President Barack Obama, triggered universal condemnation and prompted the UN Security Council to tighten economic sanctions further. Undeterred, Kim Jong Il authorized a second, much more powerful underground nuclear test on May 25, 2009, which yielded an explosion significantly larger than the 2006 test. This escalation demonstrated that international pressure, condemnation, and isolation only reinforced the regime's resolve, driving Pyongyang deeper into autarky and cementing its reliance on military deterrence. The nuclear gamble also profoundly shaped North Korea's geopolitical alliances, particularly its complex relationship with China. While Beijing remained Pyongyang's primary economic lifeline, providing vital supplies of crude oil, food, and trade that prevented total state collapse, China's leadership grew increasingly frustrated and embarrassed by Kim Jong Il's reckless provocations. Beijing feared a sudden North Korean military collapse that would send millions of refugees streaming across their shared border, as well as the prospect of a unified, pro-Western Korea allied with the United States on its doorstep. Consequently, China walked a delicate tightrope. It voted for UN sanctions to punish Pyongyang's nuclear tests, yet simultaneously cushioned the blow by maintaining sufficient economic support to keep the Kim regime afloat. Kim Jong Il expertly exploited this geopolitical anxiety, playing major powers against one another while maintaining absolute independence in his military policy. Domestically, the nuclear program was woven seamlessly into the regime's ubiquitous propaganda machinery, presented to the exhausted populace as the supreme achievement of the Song-gun era. State media broadcasted triumphant reports praising the nuclear scientists and military engineers as patriotic heroes who had successfully defended the socialist motherland against the constant threat of American imperialist aggression. Ordinary citizens, exhausted by decades of economic hardship and indoctrinated from birth to view the outside world as a hostile predator, were conditioned to take immense pride in their country's status as a formidable nuclear power. The immense financial sacrifices, empty stomach lines, and crumbling infrastructure were framed as necessary prices paid for national dignity and defense against foreign subjugation. By the final years of his life, Kim Jong Il had successfully institutionalized the nuclear weapons program into the very DNA of the North Korean state, ensuring that it could never be easily dismantled by future generations. The gamble had paid off from the perspective of regime survival. It guaranteed that no foreign power could contemplate military intervention against Pyongyang without risking catastrophic retaliation, and it elevated North Korea from an isolated, failing communist rump state into a dangerous, nuclear-armed player on the global stage. As Kim Jong Il's health began to fail rapidly toward the end of the decade, he left behind a nation shackled by international sanctions and crippled by chronic poverty, yet armed with the ultimate weapon of mass destruction, a devastating legacy that he would hand directly down to his successor as the foundational pillar of the Kim Dynasty's eternal reign. Building upon the harrowing reality of the nuclear gamble that permanently altered North Korea's geopolitical standing, the regime maintained an equally rigid and surreal dichotomy away from the public eye. While millions of ordinary citizens struggled for daily survival under the crushing weight of economic collapse and ideological indoctrination, Supreme Leader Kim Jong Il inhabited a private world defined by unimaginable luxury, sophisticated secrecy, and an obsessive, almost fanatical passion for cinema. This stark contrast between the austere, regimented deprivation imposed on the nation and the decadent lifestyle enjoyed by the ruling elite formed the core of the man behind the myth. To understand Kim Jong Il was to understand a carefully curated persona designed to project absolute divine authority, masking a deeply reclusive, eccentric, and calculating individual who treated the entire country as his personal fiefdom and playground. Publicly, the North Korean state machinery presented Kim Jong Il as a peerless genius, a benevolent fatherly figure, and a military strategist of superhuman intellect. Official biographies claimed that his birth on Mount Pictou was heralded by a double rainbow and a bright star, and that his mere presence inspired spontaneous weeping of gratitude from workers and soldiers alike. State media meticulously managed every detail of his public appearances, known as on-the-spot guidance tours, where he would inspect factories, cooperative farms, and military bases, offering infallible instructions on everything from pig breeding to tactical combat. Yet these public displays were tightly controlled stage productions. In reality, Kim Jong Il rarely engaged with ordinary citizens outside of pre-selected cadres, preferring to observe his realm through the sanitized lens of security reports, intelligence briefs, and specially produced documentaries crafted by his own propaganda apparatus. Behind closed doors, Kim Jong-il's private life was an exercise in supreme opulence, fueled by the state's illicit procurement networks that bypassed international sanctions to acquire the finest foreign luxuries. While the country suffered through chronic food shortages and imported medicine was virtually non-existent for the common people, the supreme leader's palaces were stocked with the world's most expensive delicacies. He famously dined on fresh lobsters, caviar, and high-end Japanese sushi, flown in daily on private flights, accompanied by vintage French wines and cognacs that cost small fortunes. His personal fleet of imported Mercedes-Benz vehicles navigated private roads built exclusively for the ruling family, bypassing the crumbling and potholed infrastructure that plagued the rest of the nation. These extravagant tastes extended to his sprawling network of residences scattered across North Korea, each equipped with private movie theaters, underground bunkers, high-end medical facilities, and imported entertainment systems. Central to Kim Jong-il's personal identity and his understanding of propaganda was his lifelong, all-consuming obsession with film. Long before he formally inherited supreme power from his father, Kim Jong-il took direct personal control of North Korea's arts and cultural sector, serving for years as the director of the propaganda and agitation department. He viewed cinema not merely as a form of entertainment, but as the ultimate ideological weapon for shaping the consciousness of the masses and instilling absolute loyalty to the Kim family dynasty. He personally authored treatises on film theory, directing, and acting, demanding that every cinematic production produced by the Korean film studio serve as a direct political lesson in revolutionary zeal, self-reliance, and self-sacrifice. He watched thousands of foreign films, ranging from Hollywood blockbusters and European art house dramas to Japanese action movies and Soviet war epics, surreptitiously smuggled into the country for his private viewings. This obsession reached its most bizarre and dramatic zenith in 1978, when Kim Jong-il orchestrated the high-profile abduction of South Korea's most famous film director, Shin Sang-ok, and his former wife, the celebrated actress Choi Yoon-hee. Flown to Pyongyang under coercion, the couple endured years of captivity and psychological torment before being conscripted into the North Korean film industry to elevate the quality of domestic cinema to international standards. Kim Jong-il sought to create a world-class socialist film industry that could win awards at international festivals and showcase the cultural superiority of the Dutch idea. Under Shin's direction, the captive couple produced several films under heavy state oversight, including the socialist monster movie Pulgasari, before managing a daring escape during a trip to Vienna in 1986. The kidnapping scandal stood as a chilling testament to the lengths to which Kim Jong Il would go to satisfy his personal ambitions and cultural vanity, treating human lives as disposable pawns in his grand design. Beyond cinema, Kim Jong Il's private interests reflected the eclectic and isolated tastes of an absolute monarch. He was fascinated by advanced technology, high-end electronics, and luxury timepieces, frequently gifting expensive Swiss watches and foreign gadgets to loyal party officials and military generals to secure their unwavering allegiance. He was an avid connoisseur of music, establishing elite troops of performers and musicians to entertain him and his inner circle during lavish banquets that often lasted until dawn. Despite his reputation for cold ruthlessness, accounts from personal chefs, former bodyguards, and foreign diplomats who met him described a man who could be surprisingly charming, articulate, and well-read when he chose to be, possessing a sharp tactical mind and a cynical awareness of international politics. However, this sophisticated facade masked a profound paranoia and deep-seated fear of assassination or betrayal. As the leader of a heavily militarized police state, Kim Jong Il trusted almost no one outside of his immediate family, and a very small circle of hand-picked cronies from the Workers' Party of Korea and the military. His travel habits were notoriously erratic and secretive, refusing to fly due to an alleged phobia of airplanes. He traversed the country and journeyed to foreign allies like China and Russia aboard heavily armored, slow-moving private trains equipped with conference rooms, bedrooms, and heavy security details. Routes were locked down hours in advance. Decoy trains were deployed to confuse potential attackers, and communication lines were heavily encrypted to prevent intelligence leaks. The massive discrepancy between the public myth and the private reality of Kim Jong Il was systematically concealed from the North Korean populace through total information lockdown. The regime maintained a complete monopoly on all forms of communication. Television and radio sets were hardwired to receive only state-controlled channels. Foreign newspapers and broadcasts were strictly outlawed under penalty of imprisonment or public execution, and internet access was non-existent for ordinary citizens. The population was taught to revere the supreme leader as a virtually divine protector who sacrificed his own sleep and health for the well-being of the socialist motherland, entirely unaware of the lavish banquets, imported luxuries, and secluded compounds where he spent his days. As the years progressed, accounts filtering out through defectors, underground traders, and foreign intelligence agencies began to slowly piece together the reality behind the myth, shattering the impenetrable wall of state propaganda. Defectors spoke of a society where survival depended entirely on navigating an elaborate web of bribery, black markets, and political surveillance, while the ruling family lived in a bubble of unimaginable excess. Diplomats and foreign visitors who managed to secure rare audiences with the supreme leader reported an environment thick with psychological tension, where protocol was rigidly enforced, and any misstep could carry fatal consequences. Ultimately, Kim Jong Il's private life and his obsessive cultivation of the myth were inextricably bound to his political survival strategy. By retreating into an insulated world of luxury and control, he insulated himself from the very human misery that his policies had inflicted upon North Korea during the arduous march and subsequent decades of isolation. He remained until his final days an enigmatic, secluded tyrant who successfully manipulated both domestic loyalty and international fear, leaving behind a legacy defined not by the utopian promises of state propaganda, but by the stark, unyielding gulf between the suffering of his people and the absolute privilege of his throne, building upon the paranoid isolation and surreal dichotomy that defined the private world of the supreme leader. The twilight of Kim Jong Il's reign brought a new and urgent preoccupation: the survival of the Kim family dynasty. Having built an absolute monarchy disguised as a communist state, Kim Jong Il understood that his life's work would collapse if power did not successfully pass to a third generation. The process of preparing the next successor was fraught with internal political tension, elite maneuvering, and the pressing reality of the aging dictator's failing health. The selection of Kim Jong-un as the heir apparent was not a matter of natural political succession, but a meticulously engineered plot to maintain the absolute control of the Paektu bloodline over a starving and exhausted nation. Unlike traditional communist systems, where leadership transitions involved ideological debates or party congresses, North Korea operated under a feudal logic where power could only be inherited within the ruling family. However, choosing which of his sons would inherit the throne proved to be a delicate and complicated challenge for Kim Jong-il. His eldest son, Kim Jong-nam, had long fallen out of favor with the regime after being caught attempting to enter Japan using a fake passport in 2001, an embarrassing public blunder that ruined his chances of succession. His second son, Kim Jong-il, was viewed by his father as too gentle, effeminate, and uninterested in the brutal realities of ruthless political governance, preferring a quiet life watching Western music concerts. This left the youngest son, Kim Jong-un, who shared his father's fierce ambition, stubborn temperament, and willingness to wield absolute authority without hesitation. Little was known about Kim Jong-un during his youth, as the regime deliberately kept him hidden from the public eye. To protect him and shape his worldview, Kim Jong-il arranged for his son to be sent to an international school in Bern, Switzerland, under a false identity. Living abroad under the guise of the son of a North Korean diplomat, young Kim Jong-un experienced Western culture, developed a passion for basketball and Swiss cheese, and learned to navigate foreign languages. However, this brief exposure to the outside world did not soften his ideological indoctrination. Upon returning to North Korea, he was enrolled at the Kim Il-sung Military University, where he was thoroughly immersed in military tactics, Dutch philosophy, and the ruthless art of statecraft. As Kim Jong-il's health began to rapidly deteriorate following a severe stroke in 2008, the timeline for grooming the young successor was dramatically accelerated. The elevation of Kim Jong-un required the careful orchestration of a tight-knit circle of trusted elites who would guarantee a smooth transfer of power. Kim Jong-il relied heavily on his powerful sister, Kim Kyung-hui, and her influential husband, Jang Song-theek, who served as vital political guardians for the young heir. Jang Song-theek, in particular, operated as a powerful regent behind the scenes, helping to position Kim Jong-un within the Workers' Party of Korea and the powerful military apparatus. To secure the loyalty of the senior military generals and party hardliners who were skeptical of an untested and inexperienced 20-something leader, Kim Jong-il introduced his son at high-level military parades, party conferences, and inspection tours. Senior officials were ordered to pledge their absolute loyalty to the young general, and state media slowly began laying the ideological groundwork for a third generation of absolute rule. Propaganda organs quickly went to work to manufacture a heroic image for Kim Jong-un, mirroring the mythological introductions of his father and grandfather. State television broadcasted footage of him visiting factories, schools, and military bases, carefully mimicking the distinct walking style, haircut, and mannerisms of Kim Il, sung to evoke deep nostalgia among the older generation. He was praised as a military genius and an intellectual giant, even though he was barely in his late 20s and had no proven track record of governance. Behind the choreographed public displays, however, fierce internal power struggles simmered among rival factions within the regime who feared losing their grip on wealth and influence. Kim Jong Il and his inner circle had to carefully manage these potential threats, ruthlessly sidelining any military or party officials who showed the slightest hesitation toward the upcoming dynastic transition. Preparing the next dynasty also meant doubling down on the very policies that kept the regime afloat: nuclear weapons development and total domestic repression. To prove his strength to the military elite and establish his credentials as a supreme commander, Kim Jong-un was closely associated with provocative military actions, including missile tests and artillery drills near the maritime border with South Korea. These aggressive maneuvers served a dual purpose. They rallied nationalist fervor at home and signaled to the international community that the Kim family regime would not soften its stance, regardless of who sat on the throne. The transition was designed to signal continuity above all else, a guarantee that the system of prison camps, forced labor, absolute censorship, and dynastic worship would continue unabated. As Kim Jong-il's physical condition worsened, the transfer of power shifted from a long-term preparation plan to an emergency operation. The dictator's inner circle worked tirelessly to cement Kim Jong-un's position as the vice chairman of the Central Military Commission and a four-star general, fast-tracking his military titles to ensure he commanded the respect of the armed forces before the inevitable announcement of death. Every institution in North Korea was mobilized to rally behind the young successor, transforming the entire country into a pressure cooker of ideological loyalty campaigns. The survival of the dynasty depended entirely on convincing the population and the elite that the bloodline of Mount Pictou was sacred and irreplaceable. This calculated orchestration of succession demonstrated the ultimate cynicism of the North Korean ruling elite. While millions of ordinary citizens continued to endure chronic poverty, malnutrition, and the constant threat of state punishment, the regime poured its dwindling resources into securing a royal handover of power. The preparations ignored the humanitarian crisis gripping the nation, focusing entirely on the preservation of political privilege for a single family. Through calculated appointments, strict ideological reinforcement, and the terrifying shadow of state violence, Kim Jong-il successfully laid the groundwork for the continuation of his dictatorship. The staging of the succession was a testament to Kim Jong-il's cold political calculation. He had engineered a political reality where the fate of an entire nation was inextricably bound to a hereditary bloodline, ensuring that the death of one dictator would merely signal the dawn of another identical chapter of tyranny. As the final months of Kim Jong-il's life approached, the machinery of the state was fully primed to hand the reins of absolute power to his young, untried son, setting the stage for a new era of isolation, nuclear ambition, and unyielding dynastic control. The final chapter of Kim Jong-il's life played out against a backdrop of deep physical decline, a rapidly transforming geopolitical landscape, and the anxious countdown to an unprecedented dynastic transition. For years, rumors of the supreme leader's failing health had circulated through foreign intelligence agencies and diplomatic backchannels. But inside North Korea, the illusion of his eternal vitality had to be aggressively maintained at all costs. Following the debilitating stroke he suffered in August 2008, Kim Jong Il was never quite the same. The once omnipresent leader, who used to command marathon inspection tours across factories, cooperative farms, and military bases on a daily basis, found his movements increasingly restricted by chronic illness, heart problems, and kidney failure. Yet, even as his body deteriorated and his steps slowed, his grip on the apparatus of state control remained absolute. He understood that any public sign of weakness at the top could trigger panic among the elite, embolden foreign adversaries, or spark destabilizing currents within a society that had been conditioned to view him as a near-divine protector. To mask his failing health, state television frequently recycled older footage of him inspecting military units, while doctors and foreign medical specialists, including teams of French and Chinese physicians, were secretly flown into Pyongyang to keep the aging dictator alive. During his final 3 years, Kim Jong Il poured every remaining ounce of his waning energy into securing the political survival of his chosen successor, Kim Jong Un. Every public appearance, every closed-door meeting with military brass, and every diplomatic maneuver was calculated to cement the young heir's authority before the inevitable day arrived. He undertook grueling train journeys, including a secretive and exhausting trip to China in 2011, to secure Beijing's tacit blessing for the unprecedented third-generation succession. It was a desperate race against time, with the ailing dictator pushing his broken body to its absolute limits to ensure that the Kim family dynasty would not fracture the moment he drew his last breath. That final breath came on the morning of December 17, 2011. According to official state announcements released days later, Kim Jong Il suffered a severe myocardial infarction while traveling on his armored private train during a field guidance tour. The announcement stated that he passed away at 8:30 a.m. aboard the train, far from the capital, amid the biting winter cold of North Korea. Given the absolute secrecy surrounding the inner workings of the regime, foreign governments immediately began analyzing the timeline, wondering if he had actually died days earlier, and whether his inner circle had delayed the announcement to finalize security protocols, consolidate military loyalty, and prepare the population for the monumental shock. Regardless of the exact moment of his passing, the news was kept strictly under wraps for over 50 hours, allowing the ruling elite to lock down the country, position security forces at critical strategic points, and prepare the monumental machinery of state grief. When the announcement was finally broadcast to the nation on December 19, North Korea experienced a moment of surreal and terrifying theatricality. State television anchor Ri Chun-hee, dressed in traditional black mourning attire and sobbing uncontrollably on air, delivered the news of the supreme leader's death to a stunned populace. The reaction orchestrated across the country was staggering in its scale and intensity. Millions of ordinary North Koreans poured into the freezing streets of Pyongyang and provincial cities, collapsing to the ground in choreographed hysterics, beating their chests, wailing in unison, and throwing flowers toward massive portraits of the deceased dictator. While some participants were undoubtedly gripped by genuine fear and confusion over what the future would hold without their supreme protector, a vast portion of the public mourning was strictly mandated by the state. Neighborhood watch units, known as inminbin, monitored attendance at public mourning sites, and failure to display adequate grief could result in severe political suspicion, punishment, or exile to remote prison camps. For days, the capital was transformed into a sea of frozen tears, black armbands, and endless lines of grieving citizens paying their final respects at the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun, where Kim Jong Il's embalmed body would eventually join that of his father. The state funeral, held on December 28, 2011, was a meticulously choreographed display of military might, political loyalty, and dynastic continuity. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and citizens lined the snowy streets of Pyongyang as a massive funeral procession slowly made its way through the city. At the head of the procession, towering above a sea of weeping mourners, was a giant portrait of a smiling Kim Jong Il mounted on top of a Lincoln limousine, followed closely by a hearse carrying his glass coffin. Walking directly beside the hearse, with his hand resting on the vehicle as a sign of supreme filial piety and authority, was the 20-something-year-old heir apparent, Kim Jong-un. Flanked by powerful military generals and trusted party elites, including Jang Song-theek and military chief Ri Yong-ho, Kim Jong-un played the role of chief mourner to absolute perfection. The image of the young successor walking shoulder to shoulder with the country's most powerful military commanders was broadcast to the world as a definitive message of stability and unyielding unity. It signaled that the military elite had accepted the new commander-in-chief, and that the apparatus of state violence and ideological control was transferring smoothly to the third generation. Behind the grand public spectacles, however, the transition represented a moment of profound vulnerability for the regime. North Korea was still reeling from the structural devastation of the 1990s famine, international economic sanctions due to its nuclear weapons program, and deep-seated structural decay across its industrial and agricultural sectors. Foreign intelligence agencies in Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo watched the events unfold with intense anxiety, uncertain whether the untested 20-something leader would adopt a more aggressive military posture to prove his strength, or whether the regime would collapse under the weight of internal elite friction. Yet, Kim Jong-il had left behind a system uniquely engineered to withstand the death of its supreme leader. The totalitarian infrastructure, comprising total thought control, pervasive surveillance, a vast network of political prison camps, and an elite class deeply invested in the preservation of the status quo, ensured that the state did not skip a beat. The transition from father to son was not a moment of political reform, but a seamless handover of absolute tyranny. As the national mourning period drew to a close, and the weeping crowds slowly returned to their grinding daily struggles for survival, the reality of the new era set in. Kim Jong-il's death did not bring an end to the dark chapter of North Korea's history. Rather, it codified the permanence of the Kim dynasty. Within days of the funeral, state media began bestowing new titles upon Kim Jong-un, declaring him the supreme commander of the Korean People's Army, the General Secretary of the Workers' Party of Korea, and the supreme leader of the state. The mythological mantle that Kim Jong-il had spent decades meticulously constructing for himself was seamlessly transferred to his son, backed by the same machinery of fear, propaganda, and isolation. The final journey of Kim Jong-il thus marked not the twilight of a system, but its chilling perpetuation. He had successfully chained the fate of 24 million people to an unbreakable hereditary cycle, ensuring that his legacy of absolute control, nuclear ambition, and human suffering would outlive him by generations. The transition was complete, and the shadow of the supreme leader continued to loom heavily over the frozen, isolated landscape of North Korea, unbroken and unchallenged. The final chapter of Kim Jong-il's life played out against a backdrop of deep physical decline, a rapidly transforming geopolitical landscape, and the anxious countdown to an unprecedented dynastic transition. For years, rumors of the supreme leader's failing health had circulated through foreign intelligence agencies and diplomatic backchannels. But inside North Korea, the illusion of his eternal vitality had to be aggressively maintained at all costs. Following the debilitating stroke he suffered in August 2008, Kim Jong Il was never quite the same. The once omnipresent leader, who used to command marathon inspection tours across factories, cooperative farms, and military bases on a daily basis, found his movements increasingly restricted by chronic illness, heart problems, and kidney failure. Yet, even as his body deteriorated and his steps slowed, his grip on the apparatus of state control remained absolute. He understood that any public sign of weakness at the top could trigger panic among the elite, embolden foreign adversaries, or spark destabilizing currents within a society that had been conditioned to view him as a near-divine protector. To mask his failing health, state television frequently recycled older footage of him inspecting military units, while doctors and foreign medical specialists, including teams of French and Chinese physicians, were secretly flown into Pyongyang to keep the aging dictator alive. During his final 3 years, Kim Jong Il poured every remaining ounce of his waning energy into securing the political survival of his chosen successor, Kim Jong Un. Every public appearance, every closed-door meeting with military brass, and every diplomatic maneuver was calculated to cement the young heir's authority before the inevitable day arrived. He undertook grueling train journeys, including a secretive and exhausting trip to China in 2011, to secure Beijing's tacit blessing for the unprecedented third-generation succession. It was a desperate race against time, with the ailing dictator pushing his broken body to its absolute limits to ensure that the Kim family dynasty would not fracture the moment he drew his last breath. That final breath came on the morning of December 17, 2011. According to official state announcements released days later, Kim Jong Il suffered a severe myocardial infarction while traveling on his armored private train during a field guidance tour. The announcement stated that he passed away at 8:30 a.m. aboard the train, far from the capital, amid the biting winter cold of North Korea. Given the absolute secrecy surrounding the inner workings of the regime, foreign governments immediately began analyzing the timeline, wondering if he had actually died days earlier, and whether his inner circle had delayed the announcement to finalize security protocols, consolidate military loyalty, and prepare the population for the monumental shock. Regardless of the exact moment of his passing, the news was kept strictly under wraps for over 50 hours, allowing the ruling elite to lock down the country, position security forces at critical strategic points, and prepare the monumental machinery of state grief. When the announcement was finally broadcast to the nation on December 19, North Korea experienced a moment of surreal and terrifying theatricality. State television anchor Ri Chun-hee, dressed in traditional black mourning attire and sobbing uncontrollably on air, delivered the news of the supreme leader's death to a stunned populace. The reaction orchestrated across the country was staggering in its scale and intensity. Millions of ordinary North Koreans poured into the freezing streets of Pyongyang and provincial cities, collapsing to the ground in choreographed hysterics, beating their chests, wailing in unison, and throwing flowers toward massive portraits of the deceased dictator. While some participants were undoubtedly gripped by genuine fear and confusion over what the future would hold without their supreme protector, a vast portion of the public mourning was strictly mandated by the state. Neighborhood watch units, known as inminbin, monitored attendance at public mourning sites, and failure to display adequate grief could result in severe political suspicion, punishment, or exile to remote prison camps. For days, the capital was transformed into a sea of frozen tears, black armbands, and endless lines of grieving citizens paying their final respects at the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun, where Kim Jong Il's embalmed body would eventually join that of his father. The state funeral, held on December 28, 2011, was a meticulously choreographed display of military might, political loyalty, and dynastic continuity. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and citizens lined the snowy streets of Pyongyang as a massive funeral procession slowly made its way through the city. At the head of the procession, towering above a sea of weeping mourners, was a giant portrait of a smiling Kim Jong Il mounted on top of a Lincoln limousine, followed closely by a hearse carrying his glass coffin. Walking directly beside the hearse, with his hand resting on the vehicle as a sign of supreme filial piety and authority, was the 20-something-year-old heir apparent, Kim Jong Un. Flanked by powerful military generals and trusted party elites, including Jang Song-theek and military chief Ri Yong-ho, Kim Jong-un played the role of chief mourner to absolute perfection. The image of the young successor walking shoulder to shoulder with the country's most powerful military commanders was broadcast to the world as a definitive message of stability and unyielding unity. It signaled that the military elite had accepted the new commander-in-chief, and that the apparatus of state violence and ideological control was transferring smoothly to the third generation. Behind the grand public spectacles, however, the transition represented a moment of profound vulnerability for the regime. North Korea was still reeling from the structural devastation of the 1990s famine, international economic sanctions due to its nuclear weapons program, and deep-seated structural decay across its industrial and agricultural sectors. Foreign intelligence agencies in Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo watched the events unfold with intense anxiety, uncertain whether the untested 20-something leader would adopt a more aggressive military posture to prove his strength, or whether the regime would collapse under the weight of internal elite friction. Yet, Kim Jong Il had left behind a system uniquely engineered to withstand the death of its supreme leader. The totalitarian infrastructure, comprising total thought control, pervasive surveillance, a vast network of political prison camps, and an elite class deeply invested in the preservation of the status quo, ensured that the state did not skip a beat. The transition from father to son was not a moment of political reform, but a seamless handover of absolute tyranny. As the national mourning period drew to a close, and the weeping crowds slowly returned to their grinding daily struggles for survival, the reality of the new era set in. Kim Jong Il's death did not bring an end to the dark chapter of North Korea's history. Rather, it codified the permanence of the Kim dynasty. Within days of the funeral, state media began bestowing new titles upon Kim Jong-un, declaring him the supreme commander of the Korean People's Army, the General Secretary of the Workers' Party of Korea, and the supreme leader of the state. The mythological mantle that Kim Jong-il had spent decades meticulously constructing for himself was seamlessly transferred to his son, backed by the same machinery of fear, propaganda, and isolation. The final journey of Kim Jong-il thus marked not the twilight of a system, but its chilling perpetuation. He had successfully chained the fate of 24 million people to an unbreakable hereditary cycle, ensuring that his legacy of absolute control, nuclear ambition, and human suffering would outlive him by generations. The transition was complete, and the shadow of the supreme leader continued to loom heavily over the frozen